This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We come to air tonight with breaking news in the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. Iran now retaliating against Israel. The sky of Tel Aviv lighting up this evening, as you can see on Bloomberg TV, as dozens of missiles are intercepted with help from the U.S. At least one projectile, you can see they're cutting through Israel's air defenses, hitting a structure, smoke billowing from the city. This is after Israel attacked Iran's nuclear infrastructure overnight and throughout this day. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu promising more action.
More is on the way. The regime doesn't know what hit them. They don't know what will hit them.
Iran's supreme leader now vowing revenge, telling the world the consequences of Israel's attack last night would, quote, bring that regime to ruin, unquote.
President Trump, meantime, pushing Iran to accept a nuclear deal with Washington to avoid further attacks, as the U.S. warns against retaliation against American service members. The UN Security Council convening an emergency session this evening as the Secretary General urges both sides to show restraint in the wake of the attacks, with concerns growing about the situation spiraling into regional conflict. We'll take a look at the market impact of these rapid developments this hour and have congressional reaction ahead. But we begin with Bloomberg's Mike Shepard, who is here with us in Washington. So, Mike, obviously, this has all escalated very quickly. It began less than 24 hours ago. And we heard from President Trump on this matter earlier this morning before he convened officials in a national security meeting, but have not heard from him since. Where does the White House stand at this hour?
Well, we are waiting to hear that, Kaylee, and it's a great question because we're in one of those consequential moments affecting global security, including U.S. national security, where the president may typically step forward to try to offer some assurances to the U.S. public, as well as articulate a position of where the government stands at this point. It's a fast-moving story, as you noted, and we've had reprisals now from Iran against Israel, and the U.S. stepping in to offer some support in interdicting those attacks. The president did articulate, as you noted in his Truth Social post earlier today, in a handful of interviews with journalists, where he called on Iran to try to still pursue the path of diplomacy. Strange as it may be, in the aftermath of Israel's strike, we did see the president say, look, it is not too late, but don't let it linger too much longer. Now, Iran is saying, in turn, that it sees the path of diplomacy closed off, at least for now. And the prospect of those talks that we had talked about taking place Sunday in Oman between the U.S. and Iranian representatives, it sure seems hard to imagine that would take place.
Still asking a lot of questions about who knew what when and to what extent the U.S. was involved. Through the guise of the White House here, Secretary of State Marco Rubio called this a unilateral action. He was very clear in his words that the U.S. did not take part in this attack. But to your point, Kaylee referenced these posts on Truth Social. The president says in the first person, I gave Iran a 60-day ultimatum to make a deal. They should have done it. Today is 61. It sounds like he motivated this attack.
Well, either motivated the attack or at least maybe set a timeline for it, and maybe not necessarily saying or working with Benjamin Netanyahu on today is the day. But, the whole question about how much did the White House know, when did they know it, and to what extent were they involved? It's unclear, what the actual facts are at the moment. We're reporting that out and trying to figure this out. But one of the keys to remember is that for Donald Trump, he really does not want to see this spin too far out of control, because he has a lot else at stake. We know he is going to G7 this weekend, where on Monday he is going to be making important cases to American trading partners on artificial intelligence, critical minerals, and trade. And this is yet another thing kind of barging into the agenda he has on that front. So it's a great question. We don't know yet, but we do know that the U.S. is supporting Israel while also cautioning Iran not to target American interests. And Iran has warned that it would not only retaliate against Israel, but also against U.S. interests in the region and perhaps elsewhere, too.
Mike, thank you. Bloomberg's Mike Shepard getting us started on an important evening here. As we try to learn more, the president tonight says there could still be, quote, another opportunity for Iran to reach a nuclear agreement with the U.S., telling NBC News, quote, they missed the opportunity to make a deal. Now they may have another opportunity. We'll see, unquote. For more on the pathways to a potential diplomatic solution to the conflict, the risk of a widening geopolitical conflict, We're joined now, I'm glad to say, by Wendy Sherman, the former Deputy Secretary of State in the Biden administration. She is now Joint Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center. It's great to have you back with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Does this action say more about the lack of leverage this White House has with Israel or the lack of faith that Israel had in the diplomatic process?
I think it's a great question, Joe. We're in a really dangerous and difficult moment here. I do believe that the administration knew that this attack was coming. I don't think they put any pressure on Israel to stop it. They believe, I think we all believe, that Israel has a right to defend itself, but there's no question that this strike forecloses diplomacy for the at least near future. Iran has said it won't come to talks in Oman, as Mike reported, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. We've now seen a return strike by Iran. I would expect, unfortunately, for this back and forth to go on for some time. And as others have noted, there are probably 40,000 military personnel in the region. There are maybe 200,000, 300,000 Americans in Israel. We are trying to help Israel defend itself now, but Americans can be the target of these strikes by Iran. So this is a dangerous time and a very, very concerning one.
Well, and we were speaking about the danger and what could have possibly been done in the past to avoid it with Chuck Hagel, the former U.S. Defense Secretary during the Obama administration, earlier today on Balance of Power. And we asked him specifically if the U.S. had stuck to the JCPOA, which, of course, you played the chief hand in negotiating, if that would have, if we would find ourselves here now. And this is what he told us. Not have that sound, Wendy, I apologize. But essentially, he thought, yes, that if we had stuck in the JCPOA agreement and President Trump had it pulled out during his first administration, that there would be a different circumstance we're in now. And it sounds like you don't have very high hopes of us getting back to some kind of agreement with Iran. So what are the off-ramps here, if that is not one?
Well, I think everyone is calling for a de-escalation. And I do agree with Secretary and former Senator Hagel that if we had stuck with the JCPOA, if President Trump had not left it in 2018, we would be in a very different place now. Of course, Israel never supported that deal. But now we are facing a situation where there will be, as Israel has said, it will now have to escalate in its attacks. They may go after oil refineries and the oil supply and other economic infrastructure. That will have an impact on the world's economy. That will have an impact on the price of oil and the price of gasoline for American consumers, something that I'm sure President Trump does not want to see, and does particularly not want to see as he has major legislation going through Congress in hopes to get through his, what he calls, big, beautiful bill, what I call a disaster for the middle class and for the poor in our country. But at any rate, the off-ramp here is de-escalation, but I don't see that happening for some days ahead, sadly, unfortunately, and at great danger.
Well, of course, Wendy, Steve Witkoff was supposed to be on an airplane for Oman for the next round of talks on Sunday. The president today indicating that the strikes today might, in fact, enhance the chances for a deal. Are you writing this off altogether?
I'm not writing anything off, because I don't think any of us know exactly how this is going to play out, whether the war is going to get wider, whether it's going to close down sooner. I hope it's sooner rather than later, though Israel says this will go on for some prolonged time. I think there are some who believe that at the end of this, it will create a situation where Iran will have to dismantle their entire program, which is what many would hope for. I certainly wish that could be the case, but I don't believe that Iran will ever stop its belief that it has a right to enrich uranium. And indeed, the people that I call the hardliners, because everybody in Iran is a hardliner, but the hardliners may now see this as a moment that they can actually go for a nuclear weapon, something that has not been decided up until now, and we might find ourselves in an even worse place than where we are today.
Well, of course, the actors we are focused on at this time, given it's where the activity is emanating from, are Iran and Israel. But how should we be considering other players in the region, both Iranian proxies like the Houthis and Hezbollah, but also other Arab allies like Saudi Arabia or Jordan?
Well, great question, Kaylee. I think that we understand, I don't know the details, that some of the others in the region are helping in the defense of Israel, much as they've done before when Iran attacked Israel, quietly so. Obviously, Saudi Arabia would be very worried as the head of the Gulf Coordinating Council about the cost of oil and what will happen as a result of what's going on here. I think that people probably see Israel as a very strong partner, and many in the region would like help and support with their arms, with their ability to have military capacity, to be able to trade with Israel. I think that I know that President Trump ostensibly spoke with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who in essence runs the country, and that they talked about the need to de-escalate, but I don't see that happening, unfortunately, in the next couple of days, certainly.
Yeah, well, if not peace talks this weekend, what do you expect in the next 2 days?
Unfortunately, Joe, I expect in the next 2 days a lot of tit for tat between Israel and Iran. I hope that Iran does not take after American targets, American personnel, American citizens living in Israel or in the broader region. That would be disastrous. If American citizens are hit, then I think all bets are off. Israel has now said, because Iran has targeted civilians in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and elsewhere in Israel, that they've crossed a red line, which I believe means that Israel will now go after oil and go after economic infrastructure. Iran will then have to retaliate. And Iran has missiles. It certainly has terrorist activity. Lebanese Hezbollah has said it's not going to take action on behalf of Iran at this time. I think the Lebanese government has asked them to please stand down, but we'll see what the Houthis do. We'll see what Hamas does. And look, we have a situation where President Trump has said he could fix Ukraine. He could fix Gaza. He could get the hostages back. He could do a deal with Iran. None of those things have happened. I feel for Steve Witkoff. One person cannot possibly negotiate all of those things all at one time. And he's not someone who's done diplomacy before. So he's had truly an impossible task.
All right. We appreciate you joining us. Wendy Sherman, former Deputy Secretary of State under the Biden administration. Thank you so much. And we want to get more analysis now on the military aspects of this escalating conflict and turn to Simone Ledeen, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East under President Trump and now Managing Director of Maven Defense Solutions. Simone, thank you so much for joining us. As we consider that Israel has signaled its strikes on Iran will go on for days, if not longer. Its main objective, of course, eliminating the threat posed by Iran's nuclear program. To what success can they actually, or to what extent can they succeed in that mission if the U.S. is not providing bunker-busting bombs to actually get underground and take out all of those nuclear facilities?
I think we may have the opportunity to see that in the days and weeks ahead. There were many, I think, including your previous guest, who would never have believed that Israel could so effectively decapitate Hezbollah in Lebanon, and yet they have. So I think that this is a topic, and this is an operation that Israel has meticulously planned for quite a while now. And knowing what tools they have in their toolkit, we've learned recently they have boots on the ground. They have operatives on the ground. We saw from their drone strike where they have actually announced that they had drone bases, at least one on the ground in Iran. I think that there are several ways to do this, and I'm looking forward to seeing more Israeli creativity in this operation.
Well, it's interesting. It appears that Israel isn't waiting around for more help to go after these deeper bunkers, actually attacking Fordo today repeatedly. I wonder what your thought is on this. This would be the deepest set of bunkers underneath hundreds of feet of rock. And we, until now, had heard you could only get down there, if possible, with the Moab, with help from the United States. Can Israel do it on its own?
That's a very interesting question. And I would also turn to some of the statements that have been made by the IAEA in the past, 24 hours about the nature of the damage that so far Israel has inflicted on this base. But I think it's also worth noting that Israel retains a lot of capability that it hasn't used yet, and that's also very interesting. I think they are holding things back, but when you see this huge number of Iranian ballistic missiles that just hit Tel Aviv in the last couple of hours. Yeah. Imagine if those had a nuclear capability, if they'd had a nuclear payload. That, I think the argument sort of makes itself as to why Israel believes this was their nuclear program was an existential threat and why they had to go after it.
Well, as we consider the missiles that were sent in the direction of Israel, the drones as well, obviously a lot of those intercepted by air defenses, not just Israel's own, but also the U.S. engaging on a defensive basis in support of Israel. Simone, what would draw the U.S. into this conflict in an offensive manner? Would it have to involve U.S. service members being put into harm's way?
Based on, thank you for noting. I think it is important to note that so far we have not materially assisted Israel in this operation. We are not dropping bombs on Iran, and there's a lot of chaos, I think, on social media right now where there's some folks who are not making that distinction. But yes, in the past, we've seen historically, and when I was working in the first Trump administration, President Trump cares deeply about, our U.S. personnel, our U.S. civilians, and I would expect that if someone gets killed through one of these sorts of attacks, I think that might change the calculus. But he is still trying to make a deal. He means it when he says it. It's just clear that the Iranian regime is not interested in giving up this nuclear capability or, making any real progress towards de-escalation. They don't want to de-escalate. They want to continue escalating. And again, we've seen that through their just most recent attack against a civilian center in Israel, Tel Aviv.
Mm-hmm. Simone, you mentioned the drone strikes that hasn't gotten quite as much coverage, and there's been some pretty interesting reporting around this. The Washington Post saying that the Mossad carried this out months in advance, planting these drones inside Iran, not unlike what we saw Ukraine do against Russia. From the creativity department here that you refer to, what else could Israel have up its sleeve? We remember Stuxnet. Could there be a cyber component to this attack?
Absolutely, there could be a cyber component. Israel leads the world in cyber, as many people know. So both offensive cyber and cybersecurity, because also those two go hand in hand. So yeah, absolutely. I think after Stuxnet, Iran, worked hard to upgrade its own capabilities. But yes, we could see a cyber attack. I don't think it's far-fetched to say that. I also think, just from the perspective of the defense, U.S. defense community, a lot of people are pointing to this operation, and specifically what you mentioned, the Mossad drone base inside of Iran, as something that we should be concerned about here in the homeland, where our adversaries who are buying up land around our military bases could have a plan like that in mind in the long term. So something to look for, certainly.
Simone, just finally, what role do China and Russia play going forward in supporting Iran? How critical are the choices they will make here?
Well, I do find it quite interesting that you have not seen either jump to Iran's aid at this point. I think that speaks for itself. I believe you could say that they're trading partners, And certainly several years ago, there was a big fanfare where they signed this agreement between the three of them that they would help each other and coordinate on things. But we don't really see that playing out now that we're down to brass tacks. I find that quite interesting and illuminating also for potential other quote unquote partners for China and Russia, maybe to keep in mind.
Simone Ledeen, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Trump administration. It's great to have you with us here, now Managing Director of Maven Defense Solutions. Thank you for the insights. Coming up on Balance of Power, we'll be joined by Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida to talk about how lawmakers are watching this escalation in the Middle East. But first, oil prices surging today as much as 14% after Israel carried out these airstrikes against Iran. We'll discuss how markets closed with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick. He's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lyons. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for joining us. Wall Street reacting to reports of Iran's retaliation against Israel's attack on its nuclear facilities, increasing concerns about an escalating conflict with oil prices surging, stocks taking a hit. For details, we turn now to World Headquarters in New York and Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick. Uncertainty back in the market here, Romaine.
Absolutely. That is what everyone said here earlier today on the big program. Uncertainty and unpredictability of those attacks initiated by Israel and, of course, the retaliation by Iran rippling through financial markets. There are 11 sectors in the S&P 500, Joe. All of them, with exception of one, were in the red. The only one to gain on the day, that was in energy. As a group, they were up about 1.7%. The S&P 500 as a group was down more than 1%. You had names like ExxonMobil rally on the day. You had defense contractors like RTX and Northrop Grumman rally on the day. And you had shipping stocks, basically the shipping tankers rally on the day. Zim up 6% here on the day, and Scorpio up about 4%. But that was about it. Everything else was down. If you were an airline, you were down 4 to 5%, including United and American Airlines. If you were a cruise line like Carnival or Norwegian Cruise, you were down 4 or 5% here on the day. If you were in the industrial space, the economic space, you also saw a big downdraft. And of course, everyone right now, as we look ahead to this weekend, and more importantly, Kaylee and Joe, to next week, everyone right now focus in on oil. At one point on the day, crude prices in London, the benchmark there, spiked as much as 14%. They closed out the day higher by about 8%. But every analyst we talked to here today says that if this conflict does not end within the next few hours, expect additional gains in oil prices as we come back into next week.
Well, and when we consider the potential inflationary impact that higher energy prices would have, I wonder, Romaine, if that may be why we actually saw yields moving higher, bonds selling off today, when initially you would think people would see cave-in in U.S. Treasuries. Yeah,
that was probably one of the strangest aspects to this trade. Typically, there's that flight to safety. People buy bonds, but in this case, they were actually selling U.S. Treasuries. That pushed yields higher on the day. And yes, that is all about economic conditions and inflation conditions. And of course, we have a big Fed meeting next week, Kaylee. We're not expecting a change in monetary policy, but of course, everybody is going to want to hear what Jay Powell has to say about what that policy might be going forward. And my guess is that press conference got a lot more complicated based on what transpired over the last 24 hours.
Yeah, no longer will the chairman just have to field domestic political questions, but geopolitical ones as well. Romaine Bostick in New York for us. Thank you so much. And still ahead, how lawmakers are watching the escalation between Israel and Iran. We'll discuss with Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I say this, Peter, very strongly. They can't have, whether it's going in or not going in, they can't have a nuclear weapon. I'd prefer the more friendly path.
President Trump just yesterday saying that he prefers a friendly path with Iran, even as Israel has chosen another one, attacking Iranian nuclear sites and taking out top military personnel, with Iran responding by firing hundreds of retaliatory missiles at Israel. The sky of Tel Aviv lighting up this evening as dozens of missiles were intercepted with help from the U.S., though at least one projectile, as you can see, cut through Israel's air defenses, hitting a structure. The UN Security Council, meantime, convening an emergency session as this conflict escalates, which all happens ahead of what were planned talks between the U.S. and Iran over its nuclear program in Oman on Sunday. Joining us now with the latest here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson. And Wendy, when we consider that just yesterday, the president was saying he wants to see a diplomatic solution. He's looking forward to this sixth round of talks on Sunday. Then Israel decides to launch this attack. How much does that undermine his ability as a leader in the world, yes, but also someone who is purported to be a deal maker, that this happened ahead of his attempt to make a deal?
Right, exactly. Well, we're not sure. It certainly seemed to undermine it. And then he seized the narrative. He used that sort of marketing skill that's gotten him where he is to act as if he knew that was happening all along, even though his Secretary of State had said, we did, this was unilateral. We didn't have anything to do with it. Pretty much Iran, don't be mad at us. But then he says, well, they had 60 days to come to a deal. Today's day 61, and look what happened. So get back to the negotiating table. Part of the problem is some of the negotiators are now dead because of the Israeli strikes. And so it's, the talks are sort of up in the air. I don't think the Iranians plan on showing up on Sunday, but Trump's people expect to be there. So it's sort of like he's tried to make good out of a sticky situation. This
language, I gave you 60 days, today is 61. Is this an effort to appear like he knew this attack was happening?
Absolutely.
That he's part of the force behind it?
And he has said he knew it was happening. He said, did we get a heads up? Well, no, I didn't get a heads up because I already knew it was happening. But I'm not sure from our reporting that he knew it was going to happen last night. I think they knew it was in the works. That Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, was going to engage in this at some point.
But not during the congressional picnic, necessarily.
But not during the congressional picnic, exactly.
Wendy, it's great to have you with us. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson with us live in Washington. And while the White House has been largely silent today, members of Congress, not so much. Democrats are split in their response to Israel's overnight strikes on Iran. Some members are warning of growing danger in the Middle East, with those like Senator Patty Murray writing, quote, Israel's decision to attack Iran is a dangerous and unprecedented escalation, which endangers American service members and civilians in the region and puts countless other innocent lives at risk, unquote. Others expressing their support for Israel's action to defend itself. One of those lawmakers, Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida, posting on X, saying, in part, I stand firmly behind Israel's right to defend itself. She joins us now live from our Washington bureau. Congresswoman, welcome. It's great to see you again on Bloomberg TV and radio. You see this as a defensive attack. What do you tell your colleagues who do not?
Well, first, I absolutely reaffirm that I support Israel's right to defend herself. It's not like Iran has been this benign actor that has, sat dormant for years and, Israel suddenly attacked them. Iran is the maestro, the puppeteer of horrific terrorist proxy groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. They've been funding terror attacks against Israel and threatening the United States and killed Americans for years. While the Witkoff-led Iranian talks were taking place, Iran at the same time was clearly ramping up their uranium enrichment. They were moving faster towards the cusp of developing a nuclear weapon. And it is absolutely, if we're going to make sure that Iran never has a nuclear weapon, then the actions that Israel took last night and today are the way to make sure that we can disable their ability, hamstring Iran's ability, and to continue that kind of terror. And the world is safer today as a result of those attacks.
So in your mind, Congresswoman, a military option here was the only one that really stood a chance of being successful, not a diplomatic one?
Well, you always need to engage in diplomacy first. It's not like diplomacy wasn't attempted. I mean, look, Donald Trump should not have pulled out of the Iran deal in 2018 like he did in the first place. When you had the JCPOA deal, Iran was pushed, well over a year from breakout. Trump becomes president and pulls them out. The negotiations he was moving towards seemed to be nothing more than what he pulled us out of at the time. But, I mean, Iran has continued to dangerously, I mean, the Houthis have attacked, our shipping lanes and our allies. I mean, obviously, Hamas has been, a malignant, horrific actor. Thankfully, we've been able to engage, Israel was able to engage in diplomacy with Hezbollah, but you can't, when you see a malignant actor like Iran, an evil terrorist-led state, ramping up that kind of enrichment, then yes, making sure that you can, one way or the other, they needed to be put as far away from being able to be a nuclear state, and have a nuclear weapon as possible. That's also a means to bringing them back to the table. So I had a briefing at the Israeli embassy today, and learned quite a bit more about the current situation. Okay. And certainly, I know Israel always, and the United States, always would like a diplomatic solution first, and hopefully Iran will realize it's time to finish those negotiations.
Well, obviously, we're in a situation where the U.S. is now providing coordinated support. The White House has gone out of its way to say it wasn't part of the attack, but I presume that this coordination continues.
It was disturbing that the first reaction from the United States under Secretary Rubio and Donald Trump
unilateral
said nothing.
Action.
And so we always, in situations like this, express our strong support for Israel, and that statement was absent. I'm certainly glad that the reports are that we're assisting Israel in their defense, and that's absolutely what we should do.
At what point does Congress need to get involved if this starts to roll on for days or weeks?
Well, we're going to have a briefing when we come back from the recess, and I will seek more briefings in between that time now. Yeah. But look, I'm concerned that Donald Trump has taken actions unilaterally. He negotiated with the Houthis without consulting with Israel, began the Iran negotiations without consulting Israel, and they are our closest ally and friend in the region and the only democracy, and making sure that we continue to work with them side by side and with military and intelligence cooperation is critical. We've got to stand by them.
Well, and when we consider our own military capacity, knowing that the president intends to put some of it on display with the parade here in Washington tomorrow, is this the time to be showcasing American might and power? Does it send the wrong signal when you have this kind of conflict somewhere in the world?
Spending $45 million on the display of our might like Putin would or like Chavez used to, And at the same time, his big, ugly bill is taking health care away from 16 million people, cutting taxes for the wealthiest, most fortunate Americans, shifting wealth to billionaires while you make the biggest cut to nutrition assistance and health care for Americans in modern times. That's grossly irresponsible. And, this is just Donald Trump spending $45 million on a birthday celebration. I hope it gets rained out like it's expected to tomorrow.
You're not attending the No Kings rally here in Washington tomorrow, right?
No, I know. I'll be home in my district
tomorrow. That those will be happening around the country. I just wonder what you make of this moment culturally in America. When we started the week with military troops on the ground in Los Angeles, we're going through this situation right now. People are waking up and looking at these images from Tel Aviv with a military surging into the Middle East over the past couple of months. Tomorrow it's going to be a military parade down Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C. These images mean what to the American electorate?
Well, let me specifically separate what Israel has done in this instance. They absolutely need to be able to make sure that, they are right there. We are thousands of miles away. They're right there.
The composite of these images, though, has an impact on Americans.
Donald Trump sending the National Guard into Los Angeles to take the focus off of making sure that law enforcement can be there fighting drug dealers and arresting murderers and real criminals, militarizing one of our cities and having ICE deployed to arrest and detain immigrants at coffee trucks and in Home Depots. It is Donald Trump that is militarizing our nation, and it is an unacceptable executive takeover. To have ICE wrestle a United States senator in his home state to the ground, cuff him even when he said that he was there as a United States senator. He has the right to attend a press conference of the Homeland Security Secretary Donald Trump is militarizing the response when people disagree with him. That is not how we do things in the United States of America, and this is very disturbing. And the Republican majority in Congress needs to aggressively be pushing back and assert the legislative branch's authority over our appropriations and the power of the purse, and make sure that we can conduct serious oversight to rein Donald Trump and his militaristic tendencies in.
All right, Congresswoman, we appreciate you joining us. Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. We also want to update you on a story we've been following here at Bloomberg, the fatal crash of the Air India flight, and now details from the lone survivor. Ramesh Vishwakumar, a 40-year-old UK citizen, survived the crash of Air India flight AI-171 in Ahmedabad, India. The man was seated in the first row of economy and described a loud noise 30 seconds after takeoff, then escaped the plane with non-life-threatening injuries. His survival is considered a miracle, and he may be able to provide valuable clues about the cause of the accident as he recovers and is interviewed further.
Plus, the Trump administration is refusing to release Columbia University alum Mahmoud Khalil from jail, despite a judge's order to do so. It marks the latest defiance from the administration, the federal government saying it has the right to continue to detain Khalil due to Khalil entering the country as an undocumented immigrant. The ACLU says this is an example of the administration using all of the tools available to it to delay justice. Coming up, we'll return back to the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran and the potential ramifications for President Trump when we assemble our political panel. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Under this deal, Iran has agreed that it will not stockpile the materials needed to build a weapon, even if it violated the deal. For the next decade at least, Iran would be a minimum of a year away from acquiring enough material for a bomb.
I'll also be announcing, as you know, my statement and what we'll be doing with respect to the Iran deal, speaking of badly negotiated deals, okay? We're doing that very shortly.
We will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. We have laid out for the people, for the leadership of Iran, what we're willing to accept in order to get back in the JCPOA. We're waiting for the response.
If Iran's leadership rejects this olive branch and continues to attack their neighbors, then we will have no choice but to inflict massive maximum pressure, drive Iranian oil exports to zero like I did before. They had no money for terror. They had no money for Hamas or Hezbollah, and take all action required to stop the regime from ever having a nuclear weapon.
Those were U.S. presidents over the past 10 years, stressing the importance of Iran not having the ability to create a nuclear weapon. Now, Israel's concern about Tehran's nuclear advancement sparking the launch of preemptive strikes against the program and key military personnel overnight in a major escalation that Iran is now retaliating for. And joining us with their reaction on Bloomberg TV and radio is this evening's political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, Stonecourt Capital partner and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeanne Zaino, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Welcome to you both. Rick, when we consider that President Trump, in coming into office in a second time, said he would make a deal with Iran, that there would be no new wars, he would bring peace to the Middle East. He wanted Israel to restrain itself, essentially, so that the prospects of making a deal may remain elevated as he saw them. How badly does he need this to de-escalate quickly? And do you think he has any power to influence whether it does?
I think that the idea of a U.S. peace initiative is an important option on the table, especially for Iran right now. Right now, Iran is thinking that it may be in an existential threat to its existence. You've gotten their entire military leadership decapitated. You've had their facilities destroyed, which were enriching plutonium, and you've gotten the prime minister of Israel now calling for regime change in the country. There are conversations, I'm sure, happening in Iran today saying this is the worst moment for Iran since its inception, and what are we going to do about it? They can escalate, or they can de-escalate. And we are the best option on the table, a U.S. peace plan for de-escalation.
Jeanne, what are Democrats supposed to do right now? Support the mission in Israel or oppose the administration? We just talked with Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who has chosen to support Israel in this case, even though she does not agree with President Trump on a thing. But there are a lot of lawmakers here, including Patty Murray, who we just referenced, Bernie Sanders, who have great concerns about where we're going.
Yeah, and Democrats, like Republicans, they run the gamut on this issue. And so, we had not just the other day, we had Tulsi Gabbard out releasing a video talking about the fact that we cannot be involved in these kinds of wars. So, just like the Republicans, Democrats run the gamut on this issue. But I think what is really fascinating here is that you have the president entering, rightly so, the 6th round of talks on Sunday, and Netanyahu takes this action. And so the question becomes, was the president lying when he said that he wanted a peace deal and that he was urging Israel not to go ahead with this and did not support it? In that case, that would be obviously problematic. And I don't think any of us believe that. We believe that he wanted a peace deal. So what does that mean? That means Netanyahu took this action against the support of the president of the United States because we were going close to a peace deal and he was concerned and wanted to scuttle that. Both of those things make President Trump look fairly weak. And I think that's something you're hearing out of Democrats, not to mention this is a president who came into office saying he was going to end wars and end chaos. And what do we have? Yeah. Gaza is worse than ever. Ukraine is worse than ever. And you have Israel bombing in the worst case of violence between these two countries, Iran. So it is a scary day for Americans. Forget about the partisan angles of this. And we have a president whose foreign policy direction seems questionable, if not unclear at this point.
Well, the foreign policy direction he campaigned on, Rick, by and large was one of America first. And to the point Jeanne was making on how there's even splits within the Republican Party on issues such as this, does that America first kind of core MAGA wing of his base want the U.S. to be interventionist in the Middle East?
Well, I think they've given Donald Trump a pass when it comes to being a peacemaker, right? He's already been trying this in other places around the world. None of it has really panned out, but he hasn't really gotten the blowback from the MAGA team because of those efforts. I think that what really that American First group is really concerned about is any kind of intervention militarily in these places. And I think that is where the president seems to have drawn the line. In other words, he's willing to help defend Israel, and we've had assets in the region doing that today. But I don't think that they are either moving toward or articulating any potential muscular military activity against Iran itself. So that's why I think this notion of him being able to be a peacemaker, something that he seems to have a desire to do, and it seems to fit within his political constituency, might be the best option for him.
What do you think about this, Jeanne? You remember the mantra during the campaign was no new wars. That was the knock on Joe Biden. He was starting new wars all over the world. You hear Charlie Kirk saying, how does the America First foreign policy doctrine and foreign policy agenda stay consistent with this right now? He describes himself as very pro-Israel. Does Donald Trump lose half of MAGA?
I'm not sure he'll lose MAGA over this, but I do think it is a break in the Republican side. It is Charlie Kirk. It is Tucker Carlson. It is, as I mentioned, Tulsi Gabbard. It is the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance. I mean, the list goes on and on. And, there are even bigger issues here. The idea that this was a preemptive strike is what we are hearing. But to many people, it feels more like regime change. They went after the scientists, after the military leadership. We don't know the full extent of who they went after. And, there is little sympathy or empathy, nor should there be for Iran, either from me or people in this country. But are we really going to live in a world where you don't like government policy, so you go in and take out the regime? We've done that before. We've been there. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Heck, Donald Trump made his political acumen from a foreign policy perspective on what I'm talking about, and yet he's going to sit by and support this. So these are very, very big questions, and not to mention, what does this say to Putin and Xi Jinping as it pertains to Ukraine and Taiwan? If Israel can go in and take out Iran, can they not justify taking out Ukraine and Taiwan? So these are big questions for the president to speak to. And what did we hear last night? Crickets. He's been out full force today on social media and with reporters. But last night, his silence, I think, was deafening because he is trapped here between what he ran on and now what he is forced to sit back and abide by. And that is a very uncomfortable position for the Republicans and the MAGA group.
Well, so, Rick, should we have heard the president address the American people today? Does it sit well with you if the first time we see him publicly is at a military parade in Washington, D.C. tomorrow to celebrate both the Army and his birthday?
Thanks, Kaylee. If I could just address one thing, there is no moral equivalent between Iran and Taiwan and Ukraine. Taiwan and Ukraine are free nations. They're governed as democracies, and they're allies of the United States. Iran is the greatest sponsor of terror in the world for the last 5 decades. So the idea that somehow the equivalency of China invading Taiwan is the same as Israel, attacking Iran is silly. I do think this parade couldn't come at a worse time. At a time when people are looking for safety and security, they're looking for a way out of these conflicts, to then be brandishing the U.S. might, the Army, the greatest army in the world, maybe in history, in a show of celebration. Just bad timing. We celebrate our armed forces in many different ways, and I think this is going to go down in history as the worst timed celebration that we've seen in a long time. So it is what it is. It's going to happen, weather permitting, and yet it doesn't help solve some of these now somewhat intractable problems that exist on the world stage.
Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, our great panel on an important day here in geopolitics. We thank you both for the insights with an important headline adding to our conversation here. This is coming from the director of the IAEA, Kaylee. The Iran nuclear facility at Isfahan has been hit by Israel. The inspector general, the director general, just confirming this, what had been reported earlier, not only Fordo, but Isfahan also hit by Israel, which could be significant in this effort. Yeah, as it is Iran's only uranium conversion facility, which speaks to the fact that this is still an unfolding story as we speak, one we're going to have to watch all weekend and into next week. Of course, to that end, an important programming note this Sunday, Bloomberg's The Asia Trade starts an hour earlier, 6 p.m. Eastern, to bring you all the latest global developments from over the weekend. And we'll see you then, right here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.